This is week 3 of Sermon on the Mount. Scott started us 3 weeks ago on week 1 of this new series called Sermon on the Mount. Now, this is Jesus' first recorded sermon in his adult ministry. He got right to it, and it's big. It's 3 chapters full of stuff. In fact, it's so full that it's going to take us a while to get through it. The first week, I think we made through like 10 verses. Last week, Scott made through 4. This week, I think I have 5 verses I'll be going through. So we are slowly going through it because there's just so much meat in it. I mean, every section is just a new truth that we can learn. And so we're going to spend some time in it. This week, we're going to talk about the law. And it's going to be a long morning. It's going to have a lot of educational parts to this. Now, when people are preaching it on stage, there's 2 parts to it. There's the teaching and there's the preaching. There's some sermons that are more preachy and feel good, and then there's some that it's like straight knowledge and it's just being taught. Both are super important. This week, we're going to spend a lot of time teaching. And then hopefully bring it home and apply it to ourselves by the end of this. So hang with me throughout this, and we'll get through it together. But we're going to be going through Matthew chapter 5, 17 through 20, and we're going to learn about the law. And we're going to learn, make a lot of parallels to the Old Testament as we study through this. But before we do that, can I pray just one more time as we jump into this? I'm excited for what we're going to learn today, excited for what we can go through together, and hopefully feel encouraged or feel convicted, whatever we need to feel this morning. So let me pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for everyone that is in this room, God. Thank you that we can come together and worship you. And that even though we don't have a building, but you have provided us for this area to come together and make some awesome music and learn more about you and just have a good time, God. I pray that you'll bless everyone that's in here. And if someone needs conviction this morning, God, I pray that you provide that. And if someone needs motivation this morning, God, I pray that you will also give them that, give them the energy to be motivated and encouraged. God, finally, I pray that if there are any distracting hearts in here this morning, anybody that wants to take away from your gospel this morning, I pray that you will silence them, silence their heart, so that we can focus on you. In your name I pray. Amen. Let's dig right into it. Matthew chapter 5, verses 17. Do not think, this is Jesus talking, that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, those were the religious teachers, religious higher-ups, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So we have to unpack what he's saying here, and we know that it's going to be good, because if you have to start a sentence with, don't think this, but instead think this, then we know something controversial is about to be said. We know that something that's going to be challenging to people's routine, to people's habits, is going to be spoken, and so it's going to be difficult to understand. But anything that's difficult to understand, I think, is worthwhile understanding, at least in the Bible. So we're going to tear apart this idea of, I've not come to abolish the law and the prophets, I've come to fulfill them. And we're going to find a lot of parallel into the Old Testament. So we're going to learn a lot of history today. It's going to be fun. I mean, fun for me. I enjoy that kind of stuff. So if you don't have fun, then I'm sorry. But we're going to go over this one phrase right here, the law and the prophets. Now, one thing that we noticed in the Old Testament, and one thing that we know, is that there is not a direct line to God. There were certain boundaries. I'm sorry. Jason, can you move the countdown up? It's blocking stuff. I could have tried to go through the whole thing, but y'all would have lost me. I would have lost y'all. So in the Old Testament, there is not, oh, that's it right there. That's good. That's a good spot. I like that. There's not a direct line to God, okay? So there was at one point with Adam and Eve, when God first created everything, there was this direct line with God. We could walk with him. We could talk with him. We could understand him and be with him physically. But after sin entered in, there's this boundary that enters in, and that's sin. Because we have a perfect God who is perfectly just and perfectly pure, And if our sin was in his presence, he would no longer be perfect. And why worship something that's imperfect, right? We have a perfect God, and so he has to be separated from our sin. Now, in order to separate our sin from God, there had to be a gate or a boundary so that we could still communicate with God, but not be with him. This communication, this boundary, that connection is known as the law. And so God put forth 613 commandments, 613 laws that are detailed, that are real, that are physical things that you know if you broke one, like it's easy to know if you broke one or if you kept one. And these 613 laws were not only a communication between us and God or a separation between our sin and God, it's also the way that the Israelites, the Jewish people of that time, showed their love to God. Right, like we have different things we do to show love God because we have a connection. Back then, there was no connection, so the only way they could show love to God was to keep the 613 commands that he gave them. So they were so serious about this that normally, like when we set up boundaries, there may be a few people in here that can relate with me. If there's a line that someone's like, you're not supposed to cross, I am right on that line. I mean, I'm on it. And sometimes I'm over it because if there's a boundary, I want to see how far I can push. All right, any boundary pushers here? Like you just got to see? Yeah, that's what I thought. In the Bible, when we're talking about a relationship with God, they saw that boundary, that line, and they said, I don't even want to go near that. So they made 6,000 more laws or rules to keep them from coming even close there. They built a fence around their fence so that they wouldn't do anything unloving towards God, or they wouldn't do anything that would hurt their relationship with God. That's how serious they were, and this is the law. So when Jesus says, I have not come to abolish the law, he's saying, I'm not coming to start a rebellion. I'm not here to make war on a religious institution. I'm not here to rip you away from God or ruin that connection you have to God. I'm actually here to fulfill it. Right, Matthew 5:17, I've not come to, what's that word? Yeah, you guys can talk, it's cool. But to, what's the other word? Fulfill them. I've not come to abolish your relationship with God, but I've come to fulfill it. So let's talk about that word fulfill. In modern context, fulfill means like something being completed or carried out, like a plan you have that's carried out. For example, if you have a dream home that you want, or like a home, you buy a home and you want to renovate it, there's this dream that won't be fulfilled until you build the house or buy the house or finish the renovations, right? Or like there's some inventors in here maybe. Like you have this idea for an invention, you have these blueprints, but it's not real until it's been fulfilled, right? That's what fulfill means. To bring it even closer to home, something more painful, we have a building and the blueprints for a building, but it's not fulfilled until we're in that building. Can I get an amen to that one, right? Like, we have it. Last service, all the staff was in here, and they were all just like, biggest eye roll ever, most dramatic eye roll. But for real, like, we have blueprints for this building. We have ideas for it. We know what we want. We're ready to be in there. We did a night of worship to prepare for it. But until we're in there, that dream, that idea has not been fulfilled. So fulfill, it's something being completed or carried out. So that makes a little confusion, because is Jesus saying that the law wasn't complete? If Jesus is saying, I've come to fulfill the law, does that mean it's imperfect or it's not done, it's not good enough? Does that mean that the thing the Jews have lived their life by is not good enough? Well, I think we need to understand why God established the law to begin with, right? The law was first started with something I think all y'all know, the 10 Commandments, right? Everybody know the 10 Commandments, right? I think whether it's your first time in church or like you've been here for years, like 10 Commandments is just something we kind of live by, even if you're not a Christian, it seems like. And so we look at the 10 Commandments, the start of the law, and we say, why did God create the law? Why did he create this connection between us and God? And we see right before he gave the first command, he said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So God established the law because he was assuming authority over the Israelites, over the Jewish people. right? And not a bad assumption, but like, and they accepted it, right? So God rescued them out of Egypt, they were slaves, they were living a terrible life. God rescued them, brought them to freedom, and said, I am now in authority over you. Here are my commands. Here are my laws. It's just like if you start a new job or work for a new management or new business, there's different rules that you have to abide by. And every job has like the standard rules, like don't steal like staples from the office and don't do stuff like this. But some jobs and companies have rules that help them stand out. And that's where they find their identity in, right? If I say the phrase, it's my pleasure, what do y'all think of? Right? Amen, right? It's my pleasure makes you think of Chick-fil-A because, and I worked there, I worked at 2 different ones, they really do tell you, yeah, you got to say it's my pleasure when someone says thank you, right? And that was a boundary that I like to push as well, but I won't go on that. So, like, there's a code of conduct with every job that you're at. And so with this relationship with God, this authority that's over us, this management that's over us, there's rules to that relationship. Right? And here's a bit of historical context that we're kind of missing. The world today is kind of settled. Nations are made, governments are over most nations. Like, there's not much conquering. There's still war, and some nations that are still struggling have other governments that come in front of them. But for the most part, everything's settled, especially in America, we get that. Back in that time, the world was not settled. Nations were still being formed. So if an authority figure or a king or a kingdom wanted to assume authority over a people or a different nation, they would do that with a certain process. And the first step of that process was by doing something very powerful to catch their attention. They would bring a giant army. They would bring new technology. They would bring like roads, like trade routes. They would bring new industry to that nation, and they would show their ability to lead. Hey, I have this giant army. I'm pretty powerful. Here's what I've got. So they would do that. Next, they would dream about the future. They would say, here's what I've brought you. Here's what I can bring. Road systems that will help you guys, that will feed you guys. New industry that will bring in a new economy. I have this army, but it's going to be bigger here. Let's dream about the future. So they would show their power. They would and talk about the future and make promises for the future. And then, once they've done that, they bring them in and say, here is the rules of the relationship. I've done this. I will do that if you guys do this. Here's your code of conduct. Here's the regulations. Here are the commandments. And if we look closely in the Bible, all throughout the Old Testament, this is exactly what God is doing. Right? It said earlier that he freed them out of slavery in Egypt. The Jews were slaves for hundreds of years to the Egyptians, and God came in, brought these plagues and manipulated creation to show his power. He made hail. He brought darkness. He was able to kill the firstborn of every family without even raising his hand. He showed his power when he came in. And then even when leaving, he parted the seas for them to go through safely. And not only for them to go through safely, but when the army that was chasing them came behind them, he closed the seas and destroyed them. So God said, here is how powerful I am. This is my ability to have authority over you. Now let's talk about the future. You are a chosen people. I am going to protect you. I'm going to take care of you. I've got a land for you. Here's what the future holds. Here's what you got to do. And God would say, here's what I promise you, but here's what you have to do. Here's your part of the agreement. And God did that exact same thing. Rules, commandments, everything he had, and that's when God brings in the 10 Commandments. It was right then. He said, here's what the future's going to be like. I saved you here. Let's talk about it. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not da-da-da. And just starts going through it. This kind of agreement is called a covenant, right? We talk about contracts and agreements and stuff. We don't really use the word covenant to describe things, but a covenant is, for God, it was follow my rules and I'll protect you. I want you to be my people. You are, and I'll take care of you, but assume the inferior role of being my people by keeping these commandments. This is the law. The covenant is the law. This is what Jesus is talking about when he says, I'm not coming to destroy or abolish this covenant. I'm not coming to rip you away from God. I'm coming to bring you closer to God. I'm coming to fulfill this covenant that we have. So if the law means relationship, then that means that Jesus is the fulfillment of our relationship with God. right? So if he's saying, like, I'm not here to destroy this connection you have with God, I'm actually here to fulfill it. I'm here to bring you closer to God than you ever thought imaginable. Before Jesus, there was this barrier, right? We were in relationship with God, but it was distant. It was far away. We could not be with him because of our sin. And once the sin has paid the consequences, once the consequence for our sin is paid, then we can relate with God. Then we can be with God, and that's what Jesus came to remove. He came to pay the price for our sins so we could do that. That is the fulfillment of the law, is him coming to remove the barrier between us. And in fulfilling a relationship, there's now a new covenant that's entered into. The best way I could think about this was when you're engaged, right? There are certain rules to an engagement. Like some are spoken and some are unspoken. Apparently, like a big rule for engagement is you're not supposed to cheat on the person you're engaged to, right? Has everybody heard that one before? Okay. If you said no, then you're probably getting in trouble. But there's other rules, like you have to kind of figure out, what do finances look like while we're engaged? What does this look like? Who does this? Blah, 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 all that stuff, right? Who's paying for this while we're doing that? There's rules to the engagement. Once you're married, you enter into a new relationship. You're the same person, right? When Katie and I went from engaged to married, she was the same person, I'm the same person, but now we're one. There's no longer this barrier between us because we're one. And when we become that, there's new rules to the relationship, right? There's like spoken and unspoken, because now that you're living together, there's new things. Like one that was weird for us was like what you do with ketchup, right? Like, do you put it in the fridge or do you leave it out, right? Can I get it? I did this for first service and I was right and Katie was wrong. Who puts ketchup in the fridge in here? And Katie, can you stand for this one? And who doesn't put ketchup in the fridge? Okay. 2 services down, you're losing, right? So our ketchup will be in the fridge when we go home today, for sure. But there's new rules to a marriage. And so just like when you're engaged and you go to be married, there's new rules to that relationship. When this covenant is fulfilled, there's new rules to that covenant. And so if we continue to read the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount, which we will in a couple weeks, we're going to get an idea of this new relationship. And in Matthew 22, near the end of Jesus' ministry, one of the teachers of the law asked him this: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and all the prophets hang on these 2 commandments." So, this new relationship we see, there's no longer 613 laws to abide by. There's not this list of all this stuff and then the 6,000 around it. There's only 2. Love God and love others to the best of your ability. And when we make these a priority in our lives, then we're keeping God's entire law. When we try to live those out perfectly, then we're fully living out God's new covenant with us. I mean, think about it. If we perfectly try to love others, then that means we're not cheating on our spouse because we made a commitment. We're not lying to our coworkers. We're not being rude to others because we feel inferior to them or something like that. We're not, and I never have ever struggled with this one, we're not like aggressively getting road rage when you're driving to work and like someone's in your way and they're just going so slow and then all this. I'm fine. I'm good. Road rage isn't a problem. But right, if we try to perfectly love others, we don't deal with that stuff. Likewise, if we're perfectly loving God, and notice I'm saying perfectly loving God, then we're not allowing drugs, alcohol, and pornography to be what we find comfort in, because God is our comfort. When we perfectly love Him, we don't tear others down in our minds and gossip about them, because that's God's creation, and He made them exactly how He wanted them. When we perfectly love God, lust isn't a problem, because God wants purity, and God is purity. And when we perfectly love God, we don't let pride rule our decision-making because we're trying to compensate for something else. Right? When we live a life dedicated to loving God and dedicated to loving others, then we're living out the law fulfilled. And you know what I think it really comes down to is, in the Old Testament, when the 613 rules and the 6,000 that surrounded them all had to do with the flesh, like actions that you would do. Don't lie. Don't be deceitful. Don't murder. Don't cheat. Lots of rules about like don't sleep with this, don't do that, don't do that. It's all physical stuff that's very black and white, like you know if you've done it or not. And to take that even further, to talk about the flesh and its fleshly rules, covenants and agreements are sealed with like a symbol, right? When you're married, you have a symbol of your marriage. This isn't the marriage, but it's a symbol to seal that covenant that you've made. And likewise, in the Old Testament, there was a seal on the covenant that God made. And it was about the flesh, and it was circumcision, right? So there's this fleshly thing that happened. And if you need to know what circumcision is, don't ask me, don't Google it, just please ask your parents, because I ain't having that pressure on me. But there is this fleshly thing, oh my gosh, Jason. There's this fleshly thing to seal this covenant with God. Right? God wanted to seal it where it hurt. And in the Old Testament, there's lots of examples about how it was used for pain and how it was used in a bad or painful way. And God is saying, I want your body to be purified for me. I want your body to be dedicated for me. But in the New Testament, it's like something changes. And there's a new symbol of it. And I'm going to read this. Circumcision has value if you observe the law. But if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirement, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, who, even though you have the written code in circumcision, are a lawbreaker. A person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew or a Christian, is the symbolism here. No, a person is a Christian, is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the what? Right? By the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. I never thought I'd use the word circumcision that many times on stage before. But he's talking about there's no longer this physical sign to show these physical acts and physical deeds. There is an inward sign of your heart to signify and seal this inward covenant we have with God. It's no longer about the actions you do. It doesn't matter if you hold the sign of the old covenant. It doesn't matter if you do all of the right things, all 613 of them. None of that matters if inside your heart you've not been circumcised. You've not been dedicated to God. Then all of that is a waste. If in here you're not dedicated to God and to his two laws, it doesn't matter if you do everything that he wants you to do, the black and white rules of that relationship. Our righteousness, and this is what it comes down to, our righteousness is no longer judged by our actions in this new covenant. God no longer looks down on us and judges our righteousness based on what we've done. Is what we're getting, right? And that's what he's saying in Romans. It's not about what you do out there, your righteousness. It's about what's in here. But then he goes on at the end of this section. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So immediately we get this tension where we see, so our actions don't matter and our righteous deeds don't matter, but then Jesus says, your righteousness has to surpass that of the Pharisees. And this is hyperbole because the Pharisees were the most righteous people around. They kept every law, and they were perfect in that sense in keeping the law. And Jesus is saying, you have to be more righteous than them, but everything else is saying, it's not about what you're doing. It's not about your righteousness. So we get this tension, and how do we deal with that? What does that mean? How do we become more righteous than the teachers of the law if it doesn't matter? And I think it's through Jesus. 2 Corinthians says, God made him, talking about Jesus, who had no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the what? Righteousness of God. 1 Corinthians, it's because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God, that is our what? Holiness and redemption. Romans 1, for in the gospel, the what? Of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. So when God looks down at our righteousness, our good deeds, what we do, he doesn't see every action that has given and taken away from it. He doesn't see every good thing you've done and every bad thing you've done. He doesn't see an attendance record. He doesn't see your bank account. He doesn't see every nasty thought we've had. He doesn't see every rude comment we made on social media or to people or behind their back. When God looks down on our righteousness, he sees Jesus. That's what he sees. And that's a really good thing, because left to ourselves, we would fail, every one of us, every single time. If it was left us, if God looked down and saw me with my actions and the good stuff and the bad stuff, I would fail every single time, and everyone in here would. But he looks down and he sees Jesus standing in front, and he sees Jesus' righteousness, and that covers us. And now we're more righteous than the Pharisees. Our righteousness surpasses the Pharisees because it's not us, it's Jesus. I had a really difficult time this week, the past couple weeks, I guess, writing this. Not because it's difficult to do. I really enjoyed studying this. I really enjoyed teaching this as well, and I've had a really good time. But it's been really difficult for me to write this because it's really hard to apply this to this, like to this many people. This is very difficult. Like, the law is black and white. It's really easy to tell when you're wrong, when you're right, when you've done stuff good. Those 613, like, you just know. But when he's talking about, here's the two things, love God and love others, sometimes we get into the gray and we're like, I don't really know if what I'm doing is right, or like, is my life on the right path? So I had a hard time figuring out how this applies to people. So I think the best thing I can do is tell you guys where I landed with this and how this applies to me and kind of my mindset as I'm leaving this. And hopefully there's going to be some relation to it. Me personally, I allow shame and guilt to affect my decision to do what's right. Like, a lot of times when I see my failures and sin and issues in my life, I think, like, I can manage this. Like I can take care of this. I can handle this because I have to handle this. Like, no one will understand my failures. No one's going to understand my sin. No one's going to understand the mistakes I've made. So I try to mask my failures. My coping mechanism is like with work and with the appearance of success and with busyness in my life, hoping that they'll be so focused on that no one's going to see my shortcomings. Right? The harder I work, the more success I'll get, and then that success will cover over like the issues in my life, and no one will see it. And for the most part, it works. Like, people don't see failures, and a lot of times, especially as like pastors, people just assume like you've got everything together, and it's really difficult to get that out there. And so it may show the appearance that everything's good, but at the end of the day, when I've worked hard and I've built up all this success and I've stayed busy, when I'm alone and I just take a breath and relax, I feel dirty, and I can see all the failures and all the pain and all the issues in my life, even though I worked so hard to cover them up. And I did so many good things so that no one would recognize my issues, but at the end of the day, I still recognize the crap that's in my life. And I have a feeling that there's a lot of people that relate to that today. Like, you have issues and you have problems, and you think like, I can manage this. I can handle this. No one really needs to know, so I'm just going to take care of this, and everything's good. Instagram, I'm going to put like all the good stuff. Facebook, like, put the most beautiful part of my life out there so that I can hide the issues I have. And I think what we need to hear this morning, you, me, both, is that we need to hear Jesus say that you're worthy and that you're righteous, not because of what you're doing. Not because of what you've done or not because of what you plan on doing. You're worthy and you're righteous because of me and because of what I've done. So stop trying to figure out how you can manage your crap and just allow Jesus to stand in front of you. Allow Jesus to be that righteousness. And so I don't know exactly like what that looks like, but for me personally, it means that I can rest at the end of a day and I can relax knowing that I still see some dirty stuff, but Jesus is right there in front of my sin, creating this righteousness. And that means I don't have to work as hard, and that I don't always have to be at 100%. I don't always have to act like my entire life is put together. I can fall on some people, and I can let them know, and I can be real, is what this is. When Jesus came to fulfill the law, to fulfill that covenant, we now have access to God, not because of what we're doing, but because of his Son and his righteousness.